So, coffee break's over. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear Mr. Feltz, I have the pleasure to give you a keynote to the next panel, Enduring Governance and Governability of a Sustainable Space in an Age of Astrophysics. First, I want to thank you for the kind invitation and the opportunity to deliver this keynote address on an important topic. Enduring governance and governability of a sustainable space in the age of astropolitics is, for me, completely new issue because I'm an operational manager. Operations of space situational awareness, very close to space operations itself, together with my comrades from the Space Command. But nevertheless, I will try to move up to this political level and give you some of my insights on the issue. As already mentioned, we are now at a decisive point in human history, a point at which space is no longer just the domain of science and research, as we heard, but is also increasingly becoming a theater of political, economic, and strategic interests. In this area, which has been appropriately described as astropolitics, we have to ask ourselves, how can we ensure the sustainable use of space? And how do we ensure that the necessity or the necessary rules are not only established, but also respected? Before we discuss the possibility of a sustainable governance system in space, we should first define the term sustainability in this context and explain the fundamental characteristics of human space utilization. In this context, sustainability means preserving the utilization of space for current and future generations. This is particularly noteworthy because the infrastructure in space is exposed to both natural physical influences and human impacts. There are currently around 15,000 satellites in orbit, of which approximately 12,500 are active. These 15,000 satellites in orbit are exposed to both natural physics and the human influences. One of the most important of these natural physics in space is space weather. Strong radiation bursts and coronal mass injections from the sun can affect, disrupt, or damage ground, air, and space infrastructure. Communication connections to satellites and GNSS signals are especially vulnerable. For example, space weather can disrupt Galileo signals to such an extent that precise positioning becomes impossible, leading to limitations for most applications. In addition, satellite orbits themselves can be directly disrupted. A very prominent example of the influence of space weather on satellite infrastructure occurred in January 2022. A large coronal mass ejection resulted in the loss of 38 SpaceX satellites. In addition to the natural influences already mentioned, humans also influence their own space infrastructure through behavior. Of particular concern in this regard is space debris, fragments of satellites, launch systems that continue to orbit the Earth long after their mission has ended. In addition to the approximately 15,000 satellites in orbit, around 40,000 objects known as space debris are regularly tracked in space. According to ESA models, there are around 1.2 million objects measuring 1 centimeter to 10 centimeters and around 140 million objects measuring 1 millimeter to 1 centimeter in space. And imagine an object of a centimeter size which impacts a satellite has the same result as you would put a hand grenade into the satellite. Given this enormous amount of space debris, it will come as no surprise to you that proximity warnings are part of everyday business for satellite operators. Just to give you a figure, automatically produced proximity warnings for a satellite in a 520 to 40 kilometer orbit, which is not so much congested, are around 20,000 a year. So these proximities will be operated then automatically, mostly reduced to zero from point of view of a collision risk, but nevertheless that shows how demanding also space situational awareness at the end is. In the best case scenario, it will not be necessary to avoid space debris if further analysis and observation reduce the risk of collision below a critical threshold. In addition to the larger pieces of space debris that are regularly tracked, small undetected pieces can pose a major threat to satellites. For example, on August 23, 2016, a solar panel of the European Earth observation satellite Sentinel-1A was likely struck by a small piece of space debris, causing a partial damage in the solar array. It was immediately after launch that happened. Due to the increasing importance of space for both civilian and military actors, it can be assumed that the amount of space debris will increase in the coming years. Space is therefore becoming crowded. I don't need to explain to this expert audience what an increased amount of space debris means for human use of space in the context of a threatening Kessler syndrome, like the General mentioned before. It is obvious that space infrastructure is a vulnerable infrastructure, both from natural and human-made influences. It is therefore important to mention that a sustainable governance system in space can only exist in the long term if the space infrastructure is resilient. In this context, resilience means that space infrastructure is designed to withstand natural and human impacts, not to interchange resilience and redundancy. As just pointed out, it is already very challenging to build any kind of infrastructure in space. Creating an organizational framework full of rules that can prove itself in the long term is even more challenging. This is because space is no longer an untouched vacuum. It is an increasingly congested area in which nations, companies, and actors of all kinds pursue their interests. Without space, no modern nation in the world can survive in a global competition, whether civil or military. Because the space-based infrastructure forms the backbone of military imaging capabilities, navigation systems, and communication infrastructure. And as you all know, the race for space resources has already begun. Even in space, there are strategic heights that are limited in number, but desired by many and therefore hold a great deal of potential for conflict. Just consider, for example, satellite frequencies or strategic slots in geostationary orbit. The days when space was an exclusively peaceful place are surely coming to an end. Just to give you a very brief insight, when we started with SSA in Germany, it was all clear that the 700-kilometer sun-synchronous orbits were the most congested orbits. So at that time already existed international, not rules, but agreements to try to deorbit satellites from the 700-kilometer orbits down to the 500-kilometer orbits. Nowadays, we see that the most military imaging capabilities are there on the 500-kilometer orbits. And what goes up must come down after years and decades, and it will all pass these orbits, which are extremely interesting and important for our defense activities. A few years ago, some might have dismissed this as military theoretic. But today, most of us understand that it reflects the reality we are facing. We must ask ourselves, how can we ensure that international space law continues to be respected, and what capabilities are needed to safeguard the peaceful use of space for economic and scientific purposes in an increasingly adverse geopolitical context? That is the pressing question of our time. As you all know, the most important legal agreement governing the use of outer space is the United Nations Outer Space Treaty of 1967. According to this treaty, there are no national territories in outer space. Instead, the principle of free use of outer space is applied. Outer space is therefore not a legal vacuum, as it is sometimes portrayed. There is a binding legal framework based on this treaty and its supplementary agreements supported by United Nations resolutions and guidelines and embedded in existing international law. This is above all the UN Charter, which enshrines general prohibition of the use of force as the foundation of our modern international order. When new activities arise for which no clear rules exist yet, this legal framework must, of course, be further developed. However, the existing foundation should by no means be called into question. It still serves us very well. We are also clearly committed to international law with regard to the use of space resources, such as those on the moon. Furthermore, we should ensure that the extraction of space resources will be conducted in accordance with international law. We do not want the moon and other celestial bodies to be subject to the first-come, first-served principle. We want the exploitation of the moon to be based on international law. Space should be open to all states as an international common. This also includes free access to all regions and on celestial bodies. Ladies and gentlemen, how can we further develop our legal framework in these times of geopolitical tension? It is important to mention at this point that compared to the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, any further development of our legal framework today must take into account our complex multipolar order. In 1967, geopolitics, especially in space, was almost exclusively determined by the two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union. In comparison, today we are talking about a multipolar world order. In addition to the US and Russia, China, India, and several European countries have joined the field of space exploration as ambitious spacefaring nations. Furthermore, space is no longer exclusively a state domain. Private companies such as SpaceX, Blue Origin, and Amazon are now relevant players. So how can we ensure that space is used peacefully, fairly, and sustainably in these geopolitical challenging times? To answer this question, it is worth taking a look at the past and at the proven international legal systems, in particular, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS for short. Over decades, UNCLOS has created a comprehensive and binding legal system for the world's oceans. It defines the sovereign rights of coastal states, regulates freedom of the seas for other states, and establishes a clear framework for the use of maritime resources. Above all, UNCLOS is based on the principle that the oceans are not the property of individual states, but a common heritage of humanity that must be used responsibly and preserved for future generations. These principles and structures provide a blueprint for how we could better regulate space as a global resource. After all, space, like the deep sea, is not the territory of any single state, but a shared, boundless environment. The basic framework of space law under international law, embodied in the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, has already established fundamental principles. The prohibition of national appropriation, the obligation to use space for peaceful purposes, and the promotion of international cooperation. While the 1967 treaty established the fundamental principles of international space law, including the prohibition of national appropriation, the peaceful use of outer space and international cooperation, it did not create a detailed and comprehensive regime to govern today's complex issues such as liability, environmental protection, and safety. A particularly urgent and growing issue in space law is the regulation of space traffic. With the rapid increase in satellites, spacecraft, and space debris, the risk of collision and interference is rising significantly. Unlike in the maritime sector, where shipping rules and traffic monitoring have long been established, there are currently no globally binding standards or coordination mechanisms for controlling space traffic. In this regard, there is sometimes a discussion about space traffic coordination and sometimes about space traffic management. However, these two space traffic concepts do not necessarily stand in conflict with each other. Space traffic coordination is the first step towards preventing accidents in space. A management or administrative approach looks at the bigger picture, perhaps a second step, and assumes that preserving space requires more than just avoiding collisions through coordination. Space traffic management also addresses the issue of how all states and interested parties can be given equal access to space without overburdening the space environment and, in the medium term, making it usable only at high costs for a small military or economic elite. Germany is therefore promoting a comprehensive approach both in Europe and at the international level that includes initial steps towards space traffic coordination, but could also pave the way for long-term management. A fundamental prerequisite for sustainable regulation of space traffic is the availability of technical capacities to independently observe and analyze space traffic. That is why we are expanding the Space Situational Awareness Center and investing in national space situational awareness capabilities. After all, only those who have independent information can make sovereign decisions. In addition to the technical dimension of space traffic, the operational dimension is no less important. There are many issues to be clarified with our numerous international partners. That is why we need a global dialogue on questions such as the following. What data formats do we use? Which communication channels? What criteria do we use to assess close approaches? On the basis of which data do we decide whether an avoidance maneuver is necessary? The UN Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space recently set up a new expert group on this issue. Germany will actively contribute to this discussion, particularly with the operational experience gained from the German Space Situational Awareness Center. Given the importance of space transportation, I would be delighted if the panel following my keynote could discuss one or two of the mentioned questions. Dear audience, allow me to conclude with a small personal note. We are all gathered here today with very different backgrounds and professions. What unites us is our enthusiasm for space. I would therefore be delighted if you would all work together within the scope of our capabilities to ensure that space remains sustainably accessible for future generations, for our children and grandchildren. Thank you.